Today we will be looking at topic 2, matter and energy in organisms and ecosystems. Our first standard says develop and use models. Anytime we have a model, we want to make sure that we mark that up, annotate it, so therefore all of our information is easily accessible in picture form. It then says to construct and revise explanations based on evidence. Evidence can be qualitative or quantitative. Qualitative are going to be your observations, and then quantitative is going to be quantity, which really just means numbers, for the cycling of matter and transfer of energy within ecosystems. Our first one is looking at our elements that we've been talking about, the hunk or the chan. As matter and energy flow through different organizational levels of living systems, chemical elements are recombined in different ways to form different products. We're going to dive into this in a lot more detail when we get to photosynthesis on the bottom of this page. But we want to remember is earlier in the year, we used those ball and stick models in order to make water, glucose, carbon dioxide, oxygen, and amino acids. Those balls, they were red, yellow, black. They represented the different elements or atoms that come together to make compounds. The important thing was how many bonds they could make. So hydrogen can make one bond. That means it can only bond to one other thing. Then we've got oxygen can bond to two things. Remember, the one that was the most unique was carbon, because carbon can make 4 bonds. Since it can make 4 bonds, it can make long chains, like you might see in a lipid or a fat, or it could make circles, and circles would be something like glucose. And you could have multiple circles together. You can make lactose, or you can make a more complex sugar like starch. Then it says sugar molecules like glucose, and right here we have that chemical formula. Do you have to have it memorized? No, but I do think it's beneficial so you can see these are going to be the letters, atoms, elements that we're talking about. Glucose is C6H12O6. Remember right here, that number is referring to how many carbon we have. So we have 6 carbon, we have 12 hydrogen, and then we have 6 oxygen. They call it a hydrocarbon backbone. The hydro is just referring to the hydrogen, and then the carbon is referring to, well, carbon. So that just means that sugars are made of hydrogen and carbon as their backbone, as the structure, right, that is going to hold them together more or less. When we're looking at a sugar, many sugars are rings that contain carbon, and then coming off of those carbon are going to be where the hydrogen exists. Now, based on size or the space that I have, I'm not going to draw every single one, but this is what we mean when we say hydrocarbon backbone. We have a lot of carbon, and then attached to those carbons we have a hydrogen, and then we have some oxygens and hydrogens. Their hydrocarbon backbones combine with other elements to make amino acids and other carbon-based molecules that can be assembled into larger molecules such as proteins and DNA. So sugar, you can bond together a bunch of sugars, and when you bond together a bunch of sugars, you could make a larger sugar called starch. When you bond together a bunch of amino acids, you can make a protein. Also, what this is saying is that when you break apart the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, you can rearrange them. And from glucose, you could use those atoms as building blocks to make proteins. Due to chemical reactions such as digestion and synthesis, energy is transferred from one system of interacting molecules to another. Let's define these two words. Digestion is referring to breaking down, and then synthesis is referring to produce, to build, to make. Now let's apply our knowledge of matter and energy to photosynthesis. Keep in mind, matter is going to be anything that takes up space. That includes solid, liquid, and gas. Yes, even something like oxygen or carbon dioxide or helium, all of those have mass associated with them, even though they're gases. First thing we have is photosynthesis. I always like to break apart the words to kind of get us thinking, what does this actually mean? So I have photo, and then I have synthesis. Photo, that prefix just means light. And then as I said before, synthesis means to build or to make or produce. Photosynthesis is the process by which we use light to make food. And this is the fancy definition that the standard has. But really, what we just want to make sure that we are looking at, right, or trying to find those key words we know. Process that captures light could also be called solar energy, and stores it in chemical energy by converting carbon dioxide plus water into those sugars. And that's what we're going to be making. We're going to be making the sugar. The formula is going to be really important to know. I would suggest that if you think it's a photosynthesis question and you see that word, you immediately write down the formula. Make sure that you label the inputs and the outputs so that you can keep track of where everything's going. I also like to make sure I write where the energy is being transferred to. Right, so we're always transferring or converting energy from one form to another. The things that I start off with over here, the beginning part, those are always going to be known as my inputs because they're going into the reaction. The things that are coming out are going to be my outputs. One thing missing from this equation, remember, is many times we're going to have an enzyme over the arrow. I can't fit the word enzyme, so I'm just going to write E, and then on the side, I'm going to write enzyme. Now, looking at this problem, what I like to do is figure out where the energy is. My energy starts off as light energy. Maybe you want to write that down as solar energy. On the Regents, they're probably going to use those two words interchangeably. Then over here, the energy I wind up with in the end is going to be my glucose. Glucose, C6H12O6, you should be able to recognize the formula, although maybe you won't have to write it down, is going to be our chemical energy. So here, this is the transfer of energy. One thing that you're also going to want to note here is that the matter, the carbon, the oxygen, the hydrogen, that all gets conserved or saved so it stays the same. However many carbon I start with or how many carbon I end with. If we're looking at this formula, this is missing the coefficients. Don't worry about memorizing them. I'm just using them right now so that we can show however many carbon we started with is how many carbon we end. So here, this means I have 6 carbon. In the end, right here I look at that number, I've got 6 carbon. Let's say I want to look at hydrogen. Hydrogen would be 6 times the 2, so I've got 12 hydrogen. And then over here I also have 12 hydrogen. So that's a big idea. Matter is conserved. And when we're saying conserved, at this point, we're saying that, right, it stays the same. The numbers are constant. We're maintaining them. The energy here goes from solar energy to chemical energy. We're going to say the energy is transformed. It has changed. It has changed forms. To review some other things, where does this photosynthesis take place? It takes place in producers and autotrophs inside of their chloroplast. The chloroplast is going to be an organelle. And an organelle is just a tiny structure inside of the cells of plants. Now here we have those two other words, producer. Producer produces its own food, and then autotroph means self-feeder. Again, maybe that's a word you want to know how to break apart because we do see that word troph a lot. So if you're not familiar with that, I would suggest that you kind of learn the root and the suffix. So the root for auto means self. Troph means feeder. So they're able to make their own food. Now we're finally getting down to the model. We need to be able to use a model to illustrate how photosynthesis, which we already broke apart up at the top, meaning using light to make food, transforms light energy into the stored chemical energy. Remember that stored chemical energy is the glucose. It might be helpful every time you see that to write that down. Practice, right? The more times you practice replacing the words, the easier it'll be on test day. The one thing we want to do here is follow the arrowheads. These arrowheads are all going in. So therefore, I know those are all going to be an input. These arrows are all going out. So I know all of those are going to be an output. Now, honestly, it might not matter exactly where you stick these. For this one, I know that this is coming from the plant. So I'm going to write down this is water. And that's going to be transported from the roots. The other two inputs, one of them is going to be light. And then this one down here is going to be carbon dioxide. Again, to review, carbon dioxide is going to come in through the stomata. The stomata is the space between the guard cells. So during the day, that stomate is open, allowing carbon dioxide and oxygen and water to move through the plant pores. The stomates are going to be responsible for homeostasis in the plant, right? Those stomates and then those guard cells. Now the output, one of them actually stays inside of the leaf, but it was hard to have the output look like that. So one output is going to be the glucose. And this is going to be transported to plant cells by that vein that we learned about earlier called the phloem. Phloem, food. And then the other thing that gets released is going to be the oxygen. So that's photosynthesis. If you think it's a photosynthesis question, the number one thing that I would suggest is that you write out the formula. If you have this formula written, you're going to be able to annotate whatever model they give you very easily. Also, sometimes they'll ask for evidence. And again, if you have that formula and you can keep track of what the inputs are and what the outputs are, it'll be really helpful for you. On the next page now, we have a different model. Now we're looking at aerobic respiration. When we're talking about aerobic, here we have aero, that literally means air. It says a process in which bonds of food molecules. What were the food we just talked about? We just talked about glucose. Now really any food molecule this could apply to, but traditionally we do write down glucose as our example. And oxygen molecules are broken and new compounds are formed. In this process, ATP is produced, which is used to carry out life processes. And ATP is going to be the energy we make. So we go from food energy, which is chemical energy, to ATP, which is also chemical energy. Here I have my formula. One thing you might note about this formula is that it's pretty much just the opposite of photosynthesis with one change. It's flip-flopped, and instead of having light, now you have ATP. When I have the formula, the first thing that I like to do is always label the inputs and the outputs. Going to put another E, right? Enzymes speed up chemical reactions, so they're necessary for both photosynthesis and then also cellular respiration. Notice here I have my chemical formula. The chemical energy is going to be the glucose. Here I have my ATP. That's also chemical energy. Just like in the last formula, you can add the coefficients, and that is showing us that matter is conserved once again, but now we have energy is transformed. So big idea is that however many carbon you have, that's how many carbon you're going to end up with. However many hydrogen you have, that's how many you're going to end up with. One thing that we should note, again, is that energy, even though it's still chemical, it is considered transformed because glucose and ATP are not the same thing. And in this case, what we're doing is rearranging bonds. When you rearrange bonds, you may release energy or you may store energy. So rearranging bonds just means that you're going to break. We have the breaking and forming. These can, not always, but they can result in net release. A lot to fit in this spot, sorry guys, of energy. And then the last thing we have here is the mitochondria. All organisms, right, plants and animals have mitochondria. Inside of the mighty mitochondria, which is an organelle, that's going to be where that respiration takes place. In our next section, we have a model. This model is exactly like the model that we saw earlier with photosynthesis, meaning it has arrows going into the organelle in this case, right? This is supposed to be the mitochondria. If you watch the first video that I made, you'll see there's lots of little squiggly lines inside of the mitochondria. I sometimes think it looks like a bunch of little script M's going on. What I suggest you do again is follow those arrowheads. Anything going in is an input, and then anything going out is an output. If you already wrote down the formula, like you know it's a respiration question and you write down the formula, you are set because it's gonna be so easy then to write down what the inputs and outputs are because you already wrote it, right? You saw respiration in, let's say, a reading passage, or you saw it on a graph, you wrote down the formula, and now they're asking you to mark up a model. So here are my inputs. Again, just grabbing them right from there. And then on this side, I'm going to grab my outputs. And I had to think about it when I wrote down the initial formula, but now I don't even have to think about it. I'd also make sure we labeled this again. There's only a few organelles I do feel like you need to know. And chloroplast, mitochondria, nucleus, cell membrane. It's always good to review. Something that's a little bit new for this Regents is going to be words like biosphere, atmosphere, hydrosphere, geosphere, and also really understanding what's going on with the cycling of carbon inside of the Earth. What I suggest we do is we make sure that we can break apart these words. The prefixes are so important, and it will help us keep track of where all the things are. Anytime I see bio, I know I'm talking about living things. When I see atmo, I'm talking about air. When I see hydro, hydro is water. When I see geo, geo means earth. When you use these strategies, it does make it a lot easier so you can keep track of the vocabulary, because this is really vocabulary rich. This model has all 4 of those words. And what we want to do is make a model that's going to show us how carbon is going to be moved or cycled in this atmosphere, or sorry, in this model. What we should know is that carbon dioxide is just hanging out inside of the atmosphere. We also know that carbon dioxide is increasing. We will get to that part later in the human impact part. This carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has pretty much 2 options. One, it goes to the plants. Make sure you know the processes that are using this carbon dioxide, or the processes that are producing the carbon dioxide. That's going to be photosynthesis. Carbon dioxide can also diffuse into the hydrosphere. Diffuse just means it's going from high to low concentration, so less carbon dioxide in the water, so water is diffusing into there. Now that's problematic because that's going to make the hydrosphere more acidic. So the water is becoming more and more acidic, which is bad for plants. Now this carbon dioxide that gets used by the plants then makes sugar. And again, we're following the carbon. Here I have carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide gets transformed into glucose. We're going to add a little bit to our model. We all know I'm really good at drawing. So here I have a human. The human goes, eats the food. And then when the human eats the food, they are going to release carbon dioxide. The process that produces carbon dioxide is going to be respiration. Plants also do respiration, so therefore you could just draw an arrow there too. There you go. Another thing, anthropogenic. Anthro meaning human, genic meaning producing. We're making CO2. This process, when we burn things, whether that be fossil fuels or wood, that's called combustion. So, combustion means burning fossil fuels. And if you can't tell, this is supposed to be a factory. So we have my lovely drawing of a human, then we have a factory, finally we have a geosphere. The geosphere, dead things, are going to be on the soil. And when those dead things are on the soil, the bacteria or the decomposers come and break them down. All living things are made up of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, along with other elements. And once you die, the bacteria start to break you down. So here I have a dead organism. And then we wind up having the elements go back into the geosphere. And that's known as decomposition. For people maybe who are not 100% comfortable with this model, I also have the carbon cycle here with all those words. We've got you burn fuel, that's combustion. Here you have respiration, that adds carbon dioxide. Plants use the carbon dioxide for photosynthesis. When things die, they wind up decaying. That releases carbon dioxide. And then over here we have animals. When they undergo respiration, they release carbon dioxide. The last thing that we have for this is going to be the energy flow and biomass pyramid. So again, we're pretty much just following energy and carbon in this section. I have a model. Again, whenever I see a model, I'm like, ooh man, gotta mark that up. We'll come to that in a second though. Energy flows in one direction in an ecosystem. Ecosystems need a continuous input of solar energy. That solar energy is the sun or light energy, and plants are able to, once again, capture that light energy and convert it or transform it into glucose, which is chemical energy. So here we have our model. Most of what's important on the model is here, but I'm going to annotate this and mark it up. Again, if you see a question like this, I really do suggest that you do that. On this bottom level, and every time I've done this in class, I always highlight it in green. That's to keep us reminded, like, oh yeah, those are the producers, the plants, the algae, all of those things. So here I have producer. And here I said plants and algae. If you don't remember, plants and algae are also called producers or autotrophs. And we already defined autotrophs on the other page. And where they're getting their energy from, just like we wrote down in the first little section, is the sun. Now notice, this only has the biosphere in it, and the sun is not part of the biosphere. So these are all biotic factors where the sun is abiotic. Abiotic means non-living. Biotic means living. This is showing us how the energy flow goes only in one direction. It never loops back around to the producers. At each link upward in a food web, only a fraction of the energy consumed at the lower trophic, there we have that word trophic, trophic just means feeding, level is transferred upward, about 10%, to produce growth. Growth is called biomass. Right, mass, we're looking at weight, bio, living, so the amount of weight that a living thing or a species has, and release energy in cellular respiration at higher levels. So what we have is about 10% gets moved up to the next level. And I can't fit, oh, right, 10 here. So here I have my herbivore. Here I have a carnivore. Here I have some top-level carnivore. So when the herbivore, let's say a cow, eats grass, when it eats it, the only energy that it can actually intake is the energy that has been incorporated, right? The mass that has been incorporated into the plant. 90% of the energy leaves this energy pyramid. And we're going to talk about how that happens. So 90% at every single level. So by the time you get to that top level, there's very little energy left. This could be an energy pyramid, but it could also be a biomass pyramid. The bottom means that you have to have the most producers, and then that top level, carnivore, level D, you're going to have the least amount because the energy available to the top level is just not enough. So energy is lost in the form of thermal heat, thermal energy, which is heat, or used by the lower trophic levels for metabolic processes such as respiration. Why is it considered inefficient? Inefficient just means it's really not working as well as it should. Given this inefficiency, there are generally fewer organisms at the top. That's what we already said. Here, those top level carnivores, there's going to be a lot less of them than, let's say, plants. You look outside, there's lots of plants outside. But how many times do you see top level carnivores? Not really that frequently. But you might see a lot of herbivores. Like in my neighborhood, there's tons of chipmunks, squirrels, bunnies, right? But you're less likely to see the things that eat the squirrels, chipmunks, things like that. So we have 90% of energy is lost. And it's not lost, right? It's still in the ecosystem. It's just not in this energy pyramid. And why is that? There's a few reasons. 3 that we really focus on. 1 is heat, which we also could call thermal. Another one is going to be feces. Some of that food you eat, you can't do anything with. And then the last one is going to be respiration. So this can either be called an energy pyramid or it could be called biomass. Biomass is looking at the cycling of matter. Energy is looking at, how each level just gets 10%. This where it says generally fewer organisms at higher levels of a food web. Keep in mind, that's again really referring to biomass. which is number of living organisms at different trophic levels. There should always be the most producers, right? You want this base of your pyramid to be really firm and stable, and that's going to allow all the other levels to exist. If you wind up having a drought that kills a lot of the producers, what's going to wind up happening? You're going to wind up having B, C, and D, their numbers are going to decrease. The last thing we have is matter in an ecosystem is conserved. That means however many carbon you start off with, that's how many carbon you end with. The chemical elements that make up the molecules of organisms, CHON or HONC, I use both of them, pass through food webs and into and out of the atmosphere and soil, and they are combined and recombined in different ways. So you could eat a plant and get sugar from that plant. And then that could be changed to help you build proteins. You could eat proteins and then that could be stored as fat on your body, or it could be stored as glycogen in your liver. And then it says in different ways. So what you might want to do is look at that carbon cycle on the last page. It says when matter is cycled through organisms and ecosystems, some of the matter reacts to release energy for life functions. Some is stored in newly made functions, and some is released as waste. So again, if you go back to the last page, we looked at photosynthesis and respiration. And that's showing us how things can be combined and recombined to make different things.